The ravens came down like flakes of ash from a winter sky, black upon white, and their wings made a soft hush that Jon had always loved. He stood in the yard as they spiraled to the rookery, Ghost pale beside him, and felt that sensation again, like the faint tug of a thread through his chest, binding him to things he could not name. Behind the thick curtain wall, Winterfell's hot springs poured their steam into the cold, and the great green of the glass gardens blurred at the edges. It was a day when breath came visible and words fogged and vanished. A day of blades in the yard and hounds howling in their kennels, bread baking and men laughing, and an uneasy stillness like the pause before a song's first note. The ravens meant news. They always had. Jon had learned to read the gloom on Maester Luwin's face as others read the words. One glance at the Maester as he hurried across the yard, chain tinkling against his collar, told him enough. This news was heavy. Ghost lifted his muzzle and made a sound almost too soft for a wolf, a breathy, expectant woof. The direwolf's eyes were blood-red rubies set in snow. Jon stroked the thick fur behind Ghost's ear. "We'll go and hear it then," he said, not sure whether he spoke to the wolf or to himself, and left the yard for the covered walkway that ran along the hall. In the great hall, men were gathering. Robb had his jaw set in that way he wore when trying to look as much like father as he could. The mouth a hard line, eyes keen, hair unbound over his shoulders. He stood by the high seat, with gray wind sprawled beneath, all legs and teeth and watchfulness. Lady Catelyn was near the dais, pale as parchment, the hollows beneath her eyes darker than bruises. Bran had been settled in a chair not far from the fire, a contrivance Luwin had designed, with straps and pegs that allowed him to sit upright. Summer lay at his feet, and the boy's fingers were lost in the direwolf's ruff. Arya hovered, restless, needles and thread abandoned beside her, boots muddy, hair in untamed tangles, while Sansa sat closer to their mother, back straight as a lance, lady curled like cream at her slippered feet. Rickon had escaped any hand meant to catch him and darted between benches like a wild thing, Shaggy Dog trailing troubles like a shadow. Ned Stark stood before the hearth. The fire made a saint's halo of the steam that drifted through the fissures in the stone, turning the air into a wavering, glowing veil. He looked older than he had last summer. The scar across his leg pained him in damp weather. Jon saw him favor it when he rose. He had refused the king's offer on a morning like this, refusing King's Landing with a quiet that had shaken the hall more than a shout would have. Robert had left battered smiles and barrels emptied, a few promises of future hunts, and rage simmering under Cersei's sheen. Jaime had ridden away like a gleam of brass, and Bran had fallen like a star. The memory of that fall was a bruise on the entire keep that never yellowed and faded, colored everything. "Maester," Ned said as Luwin came forward, his hand resting on the back of the chair that had once been Benjen's place when he came home to Winterfell. The Maester bowed, the links of his chain whispering of iron and tin and lead. "From King's Landing and from Dragonstone," Luwin said. He had several tubes of oiled leather pursued by wax seals, and 2 from the Eyrie. "The king," he swallowed. "His Grace Robert Baratheon, first of his name, is dead." A breath left the hall all at once, as if some giant had opened a door and let winter pour in. Catelyn made no sound, but her hand went to Sansa's shoulder. Robb stood taller. Arya's mouth opened and closed. Bran's fingers had tightened in Summer's fur, and the wolf rumbled, that soft sound that was not quite a growl. Ned closed his eyes. The fire snapped and sighed. When he opened them, they were clear gray stones. "How?" he asked. The Maester told it as best a man might tell a thing that had torn a realm. A boar in the Kingswood, a spear broken, a wound that festered, a will perhaps and perhaps not, regents named and then unnamed in whispers, a prince in gold with a crown ready smooth to fit his curls. Stannis Baratheon gone to Dragonstone with his ships and grim silence. Renly assembling bright banners like summer butterflies and speaking of justice and right. Little confirmations and quiet denials. It was a tale with too many voices and not enough truth. When Luwin finished, Lord Stark stood a moment more without speech, as if listening to something long practiced and far away. Then he said, Summon the Lord's bannermen to Winterfell. Send to Deepwood, to Carhold, to Last Hearth, White Harbor, Torrens Square, Barrowton. I will write them each as well. We must decide the path of the north." Catelyn's voice was very thin. "And the Tullus? If the Riverlands are to be trampled," Ned inclined his head. "I will write to your brother and to your uncle. We will not leave the Trident to bleed alone." Jon felt something open inside him, a stone door on rusted hinges, revealing a chamber that was both fear and delight. "War," whispered one voice, and another said, "Duty." He looked to Robb, saw the same spark in his brother's eyes. His brother, always that, though the words of others could make a man doubt his own marrow if he let them. "Father," Robb began, rough with eagerness he tried to master. "Say the word, and I will ride to Moat Cailin now. We can begin to assemble along the King's Road. In haste we may set our foot wrong on the first step and fall the rest of the stairs," Ned said. The words did not bite, but they were firm. "We will move, but we will move as the North should, with thought and with preparation. The Crannogmen are our friends, and the Neck our shield. So long as Moat Cailin stands, no great host can force itself upon us. We shall meet under our own gods and decide, not with the reins of the South in our hands like a tangle of snakes." The last ravens were settling on the rookery's perches, cawing. Jon's hand found Ghost's neck again. He had thought, only a fortnight before, that his path was fixed and straight. The wall and the vows, black cloth and true purpose. The pull of that black had been strong, not only for honor but for escape, from Lady Catelyn's cold gaze, which cut truer than a blade at times. He had stood in the godswood breathing green and water and the old iron smell of the weirwood heart tree, and he had asked his father. He could still see the way snow had landed in Lord Stark's hair and melted. "No," Ned had said, and the word had been as gentle as it was implacable. "Not now, Jon. The Night's Watch will ever be there. It needs you and may need you badly before we are done, but not this month nor this year. I will not send you north while my hall is wounded. Do not ask me again." Jon had wanted to hate him in that moment and could not. It had been a greater burden than any knighthood's belt, that refusal, threaded with love and something like fear in the eyes of a man who had never flinched from a blade's fall. He had bowed his head, because to do otherwise would have been to deny himself twice. Now he felt the rightness of it more strongly, and that frightened him too. That night the hall was quiet. Winterfell seemed to draw in upon itself, like a beast in a storm curling to guard the tender place of its belly. The kitchens made a stew hearty enough for grief and talk both, and ale flowed, though not too freely. Old Nan took Rickon by the hand and told him a tale of a northern king who had fed his grief to ghosts, and Shaggy Dog watched with yellow eyes and wrinkled lips. Arya stole away to the yard to practice with her sword. Jon watched her from the passage and did not call her back. He had given her needle again that morning, unwrapped from the oiled cloth, because keeping it had made her eyes go dull as burnt coals. "If you are to keep it," he had said, "you must keep yourself. Hear me?" She had nodded fiercely, as if a vow were a tether ready to break. Lady Catelyn lingered in the solar with the maester and her lord husband. Jon passed once, and her gaze touched him like frost. It had been at Bran's bedside that she had told him to go, voice cracked raw with vigil and fear. The words burned hot enough to brand. He had held them and turned them in his hands like a boy's toy, found their edges and their weight, and then he had set them down because Father had told him to, because Ghost had placed his head on Jon's knee inside, because leaving had felt too much like becoming a blade in a sheath he could not wear. Still, when Catelyn looked at him like that, he felt himself a stain upon her floor. He retreated to the godswood instead, where the pools steamed and the weirwood's face wept red. Snow was falling lightly, each flake a tiny star. Ghost vanished and reappeared between trees, silent as snowfall. Jon went to the trunk and set his palm against the ridged bark, felt the old cold there, and a calm like deep water settled in him inch by inch. "My father says we will decide as the North should," he told the tree, feeling foolish, feeling true. "I will do as he bids." He looked up at the heart tree's face and wished, fiercely, that it would speak. The weirwood bled its usual answer. The days that followed were filled with ravens and riders. Men came up the King's Road under banners stiff with rime, cheeks raw from wind, breath pluming. The great John came roaring, his voice filling the yard like a bell, his laughter as heavy as meat. The Karstarks rode in austere, their black hair and pale eyes like winter's own. Rickard Karstark's sons went to see Bran and said nothing but bowed very low to Lady Catelyn and brought her a small carving of a wolf from a child of their house. A Manderly messenger came thick in waist and courtesy both, ringed with fish-scale mail polished so fine it looked like wealth given shape. Ser Roderick Castle oversaw it all with his bristling whiskers and patience like a pond under ice. His daughter Beth came to the kitchens and then to Bran, chattering, and made Lady smile for the first time in 100 hours. With the lords came talk. Some whispered names, Stannis, Renly, Joffrey, Lannister, and some said none but spoke instead of borders, fields, sons who had not come back from past wars, old oaths. Others said the North should be for the North, and their breath plumed as if the very thought made the air colder.
Ned liste ned.
It was a thing Jon marveled at, the way his father did not fling his will about like a cloak to cover them all, but laid it carefully, piece on piece, until a shape that was not only his own formed under his hands. At last they gathered in the great hall. No feast, only bread and cheese and meat enough, beer and watered wine. The banners of Stark, Umber, Glover, Karstark, Manderly, Tallheart, and smaller houses yet bristled along the walls, and their colors moved like sleeping things when the doors opened. "My lords," Ned said when they had settled, the crackle of the fire the only other voice, "you know what has passed in the south. You know the doubts that surround the crown. I knew Robert Baratheon since he was a boy. He was a man who fought like a storm and drank like a river, and though I loved him, he was not careful. He is gone. In his place, shadows play at kingship. The law is what we have to make us more than swords with tongues. By that law, Stannis Baratheon is the rightful king." A murmur went round like a low wind. "We owe the crown our fealty," Ned continued, "but only when the crown sits on the rightful head. Yet we are far and winter comes. The riverlands lie between and are in peril. I will not pretend that the South's quarrels are ours by choice, but honor seldom asks a man what he would prefer to do. I will send ravens to Dragonstone, seeking a pledge that northern ways be respected and northern hardships heeded. If it comes, I think we must ally with Stannis. If it does not, we will consider if our blood should be spilled to mend the ruptures of another man's house. We will guard our borders, and we will not be drawn into any Lannister trap." The great Jon pounded his fist on the table until knives jumped. "By God's belly, speak truer, Stark. Say you mean to keep the North as the North and let the South chew its own tail." "We are Tully's kin as well," Rickard Karstark said, cold as a blade. "Shall we watch the riverlands burn and tell our children we were too far away to care?" "We will not watch them burn," Ned said. "I will ride south with an army to the neck and beyond if needs must. But our purpose shall be our own. We shall not go to place a golden boy's crown on a head that has no right to it." Manderly's man rose and inclined his head. "White Harbor will provision such host as you command, my lord. The sea is not quiet either. If war comes, it will be in more shapes than one." Through it all, Jon watched. He sat among the household, not with the lords as was fitting, and yet his father's eyes found him more than once. He felt Robb's hand brush his under the board once. A quick squeeze, the way they had done in boyhood when one of them wanted to tell the other, "I am here." Lady Catelyn's gaze slipped over him without landing. After the council, Ned called him to the study above the hall. The room smelled of parchment and wax, the hearth small but hot. The great map of the North lay unrolled on the table, with stones weighting each corner. A bit of dark granite from the Wolfswood, a smooth river pebble from the White Knife, a broken iron coin from a soldier's pay chest, an old arrowhead. "I will ride to Moat Cailin with Robb and the bulk of our force," Ned said. He leaned over the map and moved a carved wolf along the King's Road with 2 fingers. "Ser Roderick will command the garrison here, but Winterfell needs a hand to keep the ledgers and the men, the harvest, and the work. A steady one. Jon knew before his father had finished. You want me to serve as castellan? As deputy to Ser Roderick? Aye, Ned said. He has the experience, you have the energy. Between you and Maester Luwin, you can keep Winterfell strong while we move. I would not leave your lady mother. He stopped, corrected himself. Lady Catelyn, without that strength, nor your brothers, nor your sisters. Bran will need his brother's hand. I am not Robb, Jon said. He kept his voice low. They will see me, some of them, as a bastard on a chair that is not mine. They will see what you do, Ned said. Do it well and the scene will change. Or it will not and you will do it well regardless. An honorable man cannot command how others name him, only how he behaves. Ghost pressed his head against Jon's thigh. The touch steadied him. He could see himself at a table with ink-stained fingers and aching eyes and the endless litany of the keep's needs. He could see himself in the yard making certain the men drilled and the walls were watched. In the kitchens tasting salted pork and bean mash to know whether the winter stores were kept well salted and dry. It was not the wall, but it was a wall of another sort. I will do it, Jon said. The words felt like a sword settling into his hand. I will make you proud. I am proud. Ned's voice roughened. You have my name in your blood. However others call you, that is no small inheritance. Guard Winterfell as if it were the wall you would have joined. Jon bowed his head. When he raised it, Ned was looking at him as if at some distant light. There are things I mean to tell you, he said. Things I have kept too long. But not today. Today there is work. Jon swallowed against the sudden ache. As you say, father. They parted on that, and Jon walked to the yard feeling larger and smaller at once. Arya met him near the armory, cheeks pink from the cold and from running. You looked like a lord up there, she said, almost defiant, almost proud. Are you to be? I will help Ser Roderick keep the keep, Jon said. That's lord's work in some men's measure. It's yours, she said, and flung her arms about him. If anyone says otherwise, I'll hit them with a stick. You will do no such thing, Sansa said from behind them. She stood in a pale blue gown that made her look all Southron lady except for the fur cloak slung over her shoulders. In the cold light, her hair gleamed the deep red of polished chestnut. You will not strike anyone, especially not our father's men. It is unseemly. It will be well, Jon said before Arya could bristle further. We each have our part. Keep Lady close, Sansa, and do not let the cooks bully you. They will try. Sansa blinked, surprised into a smile. They will not. They like me. They like to test anyone who thinks they can command the kitchens, Jon said. Bread and beating both happen there, or so old Nen says. Arya laughed, and even Sansa's mouth twitched. For a moment, the hall's heavy news lifted, and snow drifted down noiselessly, and the direwolves lay like stone carvings come to life at the edges of the yard. The north moved with slow grandeur. It took days to assemble, then days to march to Moat Cailin through roads rutted and frozen, through forests that stood like old men with white beards listening. Jon watched his father and brother ride out with the Greyjohn's men and Karstark spears and Glover axes, and he felt the old tug again. Ghost whined once, low and soft, and Jon placed his hand on the wolf's head. Not this time, he told the pull and went back to the ledgers. Winterfell had endless appetites. A keep was a living thing that ate wood and wool and oil, candles and nails and flour, and shat out ash and waste that must be hauled and spread. There were the glass gardens to keep warm and clear, pigs to slaughter and cure, hides to tan, iron to beat, boots to mend, lime to slake for mortar. There were quarrels over barley allotments and a dispute about who had the right to gather deadwood in the Wolfswood beyond the old broken tower. There was the question of hunting limits, of whether some men had set too many snares and robbed the Lord's forests where deer were already thin. There were 100 small matters of justice each week, the settling of which left Jon tired and grim and pleased with himself by turns. Ser Roderick guided without smothering. Maester Luwin was a book with hands. Catelyn watched. She did not praise, and at first her presence prickled, but he found the strength in that discomfort. When he judged a quarrel between two women who each swore the other had stolen a kettle, he remembered that Lady Catelyn's mouth had thinned when he opened the hearing by speaking to the men present. He called the women forward next time and made the men stand back. He watched their faces, listened for the note in the voice that sometimes told a lie better than the words did. When he set the hunter's snares by law and custom, he asked Catelyn what Lord Hoster had done at Riverrun in lean years and weighed it quietly against stark practice. In the evenings he went to Bran. The boy was out of fever now, learning his new body like a strange horse. He was angry often, then ashamed, then laughing because Summer had decided to bat his toes with a big paw, and then stared shocked at his own boldness. Jon told him stories and listened to old Nan's tales again, as if he had not heard each 20 times. Bran spoke with a wonder that had teeth in it about the way he felt Summer's dreams sometimes, how the smells were shapes and the world was made of edges and warmth and cold. Jon did not know what to do with that, so he only asked questions until Bran smiled and spoke on. Arya and Sansa circled as they had when they were small, quarrelsome and tender by nightfall. Arya sought out the yard whenever she could, and Jon paired her sometimes with Hullen's boy for practice with blunted sticks because the boy was quick and did not have the heaviness that made some of the stable lads look at Arya as if she were a game. Sansa spent more time with her needle and with the lady wives of the bannermen who had remained, learning the economy of households and the politics of courtesies. Once Jon passed the open door of a solar and heard Sansa argue, in her sweet, careful voice, that Manderley's cooks deserved their cow and a half for a feast when the Lord of White Harbor returned. But no more, for life in winter was built on the bits men saved. He paused and smiled, but did not enter. The first news of the sea trouble came soaked and salt-rimed from a fisherman out of Sea Dragon Point. He had put in at a hidden cove because his mast had cracked at the top and he feared to limp around to White Harbor with the wind wrong. He had seen black sails. Not many, but some. Iron-borne sails. He had a rent in his side where a thrown hook had grazed him. He had pulled it free and rode in the dark. Jon sat him by the hearth and fed him fish stew and penny ale, and then sent him to Maester Luwin. Ravens to Deepwood and to Torrhen Square, Jon said, heart running fast. He tucked away the thrill that leapt in him, the way it always leapt when danger put its teeth into the day and shook. Double the watches on the walls. Arm the men.
Ser Rodrik Nadid.
He ran his hand through his whiskers. We will hold Winterfell. It will take more than a few longships to trouble us here. But the coasts will bleed if we are blind, Jon finished. Send riders to the rills to Barrowton. If Lord Dustin Stewart has men to spare, we need them on the shore. And send to White Harbor. The Manderleys will defend their own, but they'll stand stronger if they know we know and are watching. Catelyn came to him after, a quiet of robes and soft leather. You do well, she said, the words so unexpected he stared. She stood as if poised on a step, the next movement up or down not yet decided. Do not let praise make you careless. It does that to men sometimes. Then, after a beat, I am not your friend, Jon, and I do not pretend to be, but you are your father's son in many ways, and Winterfell needs that. If you guard my children, I will not hinder you. It was as if someone had opened shutters in a long-closed room and let in a line of light. Jon bowed his head. I will guard them. Arya burst into the hall with mud to her knees and a willow switch in her hand and demanded to know if she could go to the coast and see the longships. Ghost rose and leaned against Jon's leg next as if to say, she is ours to watch. He denied Arya, and she glared and stomped and then made up for it by teaching Bran's pony to follow a halting series of commands down the unused southern corridor. His shout when the pony nosed open a door on his own won more smiles than the last snowfall. The second word of Ironborn came with fire. It was a farmstead on the stony shore, old men and women and 2 young boys left to guard it, and it was Ash. The rider who brought the tale had ridden 2 days in the dark, his horse staggering to reach them. Jon set the bell, and Winterfell's heart woke like a forge. Men gathered, counted, armed. He sent 100 under Jory to ride west and harry the Ironmen's raiding parties where they could, with orders like a blade's edge. Do not be lured into traps. Do not die for a barn. He wrote to his father and to Robb with a hand that shook only once. Theon Greyjoy stood in the yard and watched under his hood, face unreadable as a coin. That night Theon came to him with wine and a grin that had too many teeth in it. "There's work at last," he said. "We'll show them iron for iron, hey?" "You're not going," Jon said. It was not his decision precisely. Ser Rodrik had judged it, and yet he was relieved to give it. "You remain with Lady Catelyn and Ser Rodrik. We may need every sword here, if more than raiders come." Theon Greyjoy left to defend a stone keep while fissures burn, Theon said, the grin widening and then failing. "It will make a song. It'll make a winter," Jon said. "Songs don't boil oats." A flush rose in Theon's face. "My father will know at least," he said, and there was the edge of a boast in it that tried to bite and did not. "I'll ride when Stark rides proper." "Perhaps," Jon said. He liked Theon in moments, hated him in others, and in some moments simply wished the Greyjoy had either been broken by their winter or softened by it. Neither had happened. He was a slender blade that would not bend and had not snapped. The raiding did not stop, came in bites like a fox on a flank, and it stung. Jon sent men where he could, more than once in person to the outlying villages where a dozen sheep and a dry store of oats meant the difference between survival and starving in a bad snow. He learned to respect the women who ran those villages like they were small keeps, and he learned when to simply hand a sack of salt and keep his mouth shut and when to speak of duty like a priest speaks of prayer. Ghost ranged the forest edges with him sometimes, and Jon saw the print of men's boots where they should not be and found the charred circle of a fire covered poorly. With those clues came suspicion. Ironborn do not tread far inland. Someone else was watching Winterfell. He found the someone in the grain store near the old West Tower, where a sack had been cut and then tied up too neatly to be a rat's work. Jon went at midnight, alone except for Ghost, and waited in the cold until his bones felt hollow. He heard the scrape of leather on wood, the soft curse of a man who had stubbed his toe, and the shape that eased itself through the door was bent and carrying a bundle like a woman's belly. Ghost moved before Jon had willed it, silent and deadly, and the man froze, bundle jolting, squeak half swallowed. "Set it down," Jon said. Slowly, the man wore rags over furs that stank. He had a knife and did not reach for it. His hair was a dead black, oily. He smiled, and it was not a pleasant thing. "My lord," he said, and his voice had the drawly tone of the Dreadfort's lands. "Only a bit of grain. Winter kings feed their poor, do they not?" Jon came closer. Ghost's teeth were inches from the man's hand. The face was not one Jon knew, and yet he knew the shape of him. Reek whispered a tale old Nan had been careful with. The Boltons kept such men as other men keep hounds. He crouched and slipped the bundle with his blade, revealing not only grain but a short double-curved knife like those Ramsay Snow had been rumored to carry. "What house do you serve?" Jon asked. The man licked his lips. "House Stark, my lord," he said, and the grin made the lie a wet thing. "All the north. Maester Luwin will want to ask you questions," Jon said. "Ser Rodrik will want to hear you." He did not yet say that the man would lose a hand for theft, not out of softness, but because he wanted the questions answered cleanly. The man moved. Ghost leapt. It would have been fool's play to any other thief to go to the blade with a dire wolf ear-lengthed, but the man was not other thieves. He twisted and turned so fast he seemed to melt. His knife flashed, and Ghost's snarl was a ripping thing in the quiet. Jon's sword came out before his thought did. He struck the thief's arm with the flat, hard. The knife fell and skittered. Ghost had the man by the shoulder and shook once. When the wolf let go, the man sagged to the floor whining like a beaten pig. They put him in the old wood cell under the bell tower and set a guard of men Jon trusted. In the morning, Ser Rodrik questioned him until the man's lies unraveled into so many threads Jon wondered how he had held them together for so long. He had served a dozen houses by his own telling and likely none by truth. He was certainly a Bolton man, or had been, and had spent time in the shadows of a bastard's work. Ramsay Snow had left the Dreadfort months before, with men he had found who had nothing to lose and the skill to make it expensive for others when they died. They had drifted where work called them, and Winterfell had called like a well-lit house calls to moths. "Send word to the dread fort," Ser Rodrik said, whiskers bristling. "We will see if Lord Bolton prefers to keep better watch of his stray dogs." Jon thought of that, and the thought did not sit well. "We should keep our eyes and our dogs," he said. "So we will," Ser Rodrik said. "But we will also keep courtesy. Neighbors may become enemies quickly enough without us pushing." He was right. It irked Jon and pleased him both that he had men to tell him so. Winter deepened. The days came miserly and went poorer still, the light a thin coin. Jon counted candles and oil and the number of blankets that could be spared for a family whose house had burned. He set the men to clearing drifts along the inner wall and to tightening the lintel stones in the old parts of the keep, where mortar had cracked like ice on a stream. He went to the rookery to send birds and had long talks with Maester Luwin about things beyond the necessities. The old kings of winter, chains and what links were made of and why, the way a raven flew more sure than a swallow in bad weather and the words the birds knew enough to mimic, wildlings and wights in old stories and new. Luwin did not believe in the old magic, except insofar as belief was a sort of magic of its own, and yet he listened when Jon said he felt something in the godswood that did not feel like belief. Luwin said that feeling was a true thing too, then told him how to calculate breadths of beams to support a new granary roof so it would not collapse in heavy snow. Arya raised blisters on her hands and learned to spit in a way that made old Ser Rodrik shake his head and hide a smile. Sansa made lists that kept the keep running as smoothly as any verse, and Lady followed her like a ghost, cautious and curious both. Bran learned to balance with his hands and one good leg, and laughed like fire when Summer let him hang on to his fur and drag himself in a game that made every adult in the hall unstrung by the fear and then restrung by the joy. Rickon sometimes vanished to the crypts and came back ghost-faced and proud. Jon let him because Rickon always came back, and because Shaggy Dog's eyes seemed wiser in the dark. News from the south came in tides. Stannis had sent a letter to Winterfell that was not flowery, that was in fact relentless as a tide. One phrase repeated until it seemed to carve itself into the eye. "Cersei's children are not Baratheon's issue." It named proof and witness with a lawyer's calm. Stannis wrote of law and of the cold fairness of iron. He demanded allegiance. He promised to rule with justice as hard as clean metal. Renly had sent no letter to Winterfell, but to the Riverlands he sent banners and promises of feasts. Catelyn's brother Edmure wrote that the Lannisters had moved as a fist into the Riverlands regardless, Ser Gregor Clegane riding with fire. Lord Tywin stirred from the rock as a bear disturbed, hungrily cautious. There was a great wide tearing down the south that Jon felt as a low sound through stone. At the turning of the year, Theon Greyjoy received a raven he did not share with Jon. He read it, white-faced and set, and went to Lady Catelyn and then to Ser Rodrik, hatless in the snow, and demanded leave to return to Pike to speak to his father. Jon learned it later, as one learns it all in a keep. Some man's second cousin had a wife whose sister was a potgirl with good ears. "You will return?" Jon asked Theon when he found him in the armory later, acting as if the place were his, running a cloth along a blade in long, slow strokes. "Of course I will return," Theon said. "Where would I find a hunt so good for wolves? Stark will want to hear what the Iron King says to his son." He smiled, that gleam again. "You are a ward," Jon said. "Not a hostage. Not any longer." "You're wrong," Theon said, and the smile was gone as if it had never been. He set the blade down and leaned against the anvil, his eyes shining with something like hatred, something like longing. "We are all hostages, Snow. Only a few of us can name our jailers. Do you want to live as a fish and die as smoke in your own hall?" Jon asked. The question landed harder than he meant. "You have lived a northern winter. Is there nothing in you that—" "What?" Theon's mouth twisted. "Thinks of furs and fires and women who do not smell of salt? All men think of those, but my blood tastes of brine and storm. You feel your gods creep in a grove at night. I hear mine beating on the cliffs. You are not your father," Jon said, "nor your uncles. And you are not your father either," Theon said neatly, as if he had sheathed and drawn again. And yet here we are. He pushed off the anvil. I will return if there is a road back. Perhaps I will bring a crown, and we will see if your wolves will bow. They did not part cleanly. Theon rode under a sky like slate, with a small guard, and Ghost watched him go with a low rumble in his chest that Jon felt in his own bones. The spring, if it could be called that, came like a knife through cloth and then stopped, snagged on winter's seam. There were days of soft melt and then nights of hard frost that made roofs creak. Jon pulled men off walls to mend roofs, then drove them back up again when word came of longships. He slept little. Catelyn slept less, by the look of her. Bran slept like a boy and woke sometimes like a man dreaming, eyes strange, and told Jon about crows with 3 eyes that perched on the weirwood's shoulder and spoke in riddles that were not, in truth, riddles at all. Perhaps you will grow to be a wizard, Jon said lightly, and yet the word touched off a tremor in him as if someone had plucked a string he could not see. Perhaps I will be a cat, Bran said with an enormous seriousness, and Summer thumped his tail, and they both laughed until they coughed for breath. The longships came thicker. They pulled into inlets and harbors like teeth into soft meat and chewed until the flesh was gone. Jon sent what he could and played a game with claws and the thought of a sea that could not be chained. He grew used to the feel of Ghost's fur under his fingers as they stood on the wall at night listening to the wolves beyond, voices calling and answering in a speech older than the hall itself, and sometimes he felt that if he only listened a little harder he would understand the words. The day the Ironborn came to Winterfell itself was a day of rain. It came a fine mist in the morning, blurring the yard into a painting. It came a steady whisper at midday, a sound constant enough to become silence, and in the afternoon it came with weight, pinning men inside their hoods and hunching their shoulders. Jon had sent men to Torrhen's Square 3 days before with food and a message to Lady Tallheart. He had sent more to the stony shore to set lookouts along the low cliffs. He had half of his chosen men in the yard practicing spear walls because the rain had kept them from the outer works, and men grown too used to comforts grow sloppy. It was then that the bells rang. He did not run. He would remember that later with a sort of pride. He moved to the walls at a quick walk, Ghost at his side, and took the stairs 2 at a time and came out into rain so thick it seemed a curtain. Through it he saw them. A cluster of raiders moving between the outer buildings with a confidence that meant someone had found a weak latch or an old postern. They were not many, which meant they believed themselves enough. They carried shields painted with waves and krakens, wore iron that had never feared a spot of rust. Jon did not shout for a full alarm. He took the men nearest him and pointed. "You to the kitchens," he said. "You to the old stable." He sent 2 to the bell tower to ring in a pattern for an incursion inside the walls. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. And then he took a dozen himself and went down the rear stairs to come behind the raiders. Ghost went ahead like a thought, like a promise. They met the first Ironborn by the old well where women had once gathered in summer dusk. The man's beard was knotted with bits of bone and seashell. He grinned when he saw Jon and lifted an axe. He did not grin long. Jon did not fight beautifully. He fought as he had been taught at Winterfell by men who had killed for duty, not songs, and by men who had died badly and had their lessons told in low voices over bread and salt. He ducked and moved close and lifted his shield full under the blow and drove his sword into the gap between gorget and breastplate and twisted. The man made a sound like a seal in a trap and fell. The courtyard filled with men and rain and the sound of steel. It seemed sometimes, in fighting, that time broke into small pieces and a man could pick up the ones he liked and turn them as he chose. Jon did not feel that now. Time was a river and he was in it, and he did not choose which way the current pulled. Men shouted. Men bled. A boy Jon knew by his laugh died with his hand outstretched toward a friend who did not see him. Ghost took a man by the calf and then the throat, red against white, and shook until there was only stillness. Jon waded forward. Ser Rodrik appeared through the rain like a tree uprooted and swinging in the flood and fought beside him with a grace that made the old knight seem a young one. The Ironborn did not break. They were too few for breaking. They cut and cut again and then they were cut. The last of them tried to break for the smithy and found 3 boys of the household armed with long-handled chisels waiting like furies. When it was done, Jon stood with rain and blood on his face and watched the water carry a thin pink ribbon toward a drain. He listened. He heard something else beyond the walls. The alarm on the outer works had not rung cleanly. He had forbid it. He heard a horn. It was not an ironborn horn. It was a northern horn. They came then through the gatehouse like ghosts, not ironborn, but men of the Dreadfort and their friends. Jon had thought himself clever. He had been cleverer than nothing. He had known this might come. He had expected only knives in the dark and fires in stores. Instead, the storm had offered cover for a bolder play. Ramsay Snow had brought men to Winterfell while Ironborn bit the shore, and he had made the Iron Men his dogs without their knowing it. Set them barking at the door and come through the window while the house slept. He had to decide, and quickly. To fight two enemies at once would be to bleed twice. Jon made up his mind. He took a bell rope and rang 3 long, 2 short, 3 long. Winterfell's call to flood a zone. It meant overturn buckets and send men with water and break barrels, but here it meant emptying the yard and drenching the stones. He had men carry oil too, and he had them douse the outer steps slick. He knew his keep. He knew where men would put their boots. Ramsay's men came up laughing at first, confident. They were not expecting to laugh on their backs. Men slipped and fell and bore men down behind them and then made a slick and were spitted. Jon kept the center of the yard and made it a place no man could pass without a lesson. He was not a giant of a fighter. He was quick and growing. He was not a knight. Knights were Southron stories. He was a Stark, and what that meant was in the way his breath came even and his arm did not tire because he had built up the muscles clicking at ink and lifting grain sacks and drilly. Ing with spears until his shoulders ached and he slept like a dead man. It was in the way Ghost moved to fill his weak side without a word from him, and the way he heard, above the rain and the metal song, the sound of Rickon crying in the kitchens and then laughing because Shaggy Dog had stolen a wooden bowl and refused to give it back. Ramsay Snow came in at last, the man himself, and he was not much to look at. He had pale eyes and a mouth that did not know how to smile, only bare teeth. He wore a dark cloak sodden with rain and a fur too fine for his supposed station. He had 3 men at his back and he did not tire. He came forward as if to a feast and tossed a man's life away with the careless speed of someone throwing bones to a dog. He saw Jon and tilted his head as if to listen to how his name sounded in his own mind. "Who are you?" Ramsay asked, and his voice was gentle as rotten wood. "No one," Jon said. He did not mean it as a riddle. He meant it as the only answer that would serve both of them. He lunged. Ramsay was better than Jon had hoped and worse than he had feared. He was cunning and quick, but he loved his own cunning the way some men love their own faces in a mirror, and he tried to make a show of it. Jon made no show. He pressed forward, shield up, sword working in hard short lines, and when Ramsay made a flourish, Jon hit him in the ribs with the shield edge, hard enough to crack, and then cut at the thigh. Ramsay retreated, eyes bright with a pleasure that made Jon's stomach turn. "This is Winterfell," Jon said, quiet but hard. "You do not belong here." Ramsay's eyes flicked left, then right. "I belong wherever there is sport." Ghost came in then like snow falling off a roof. He hit one of Ramsay's men and took him down with so little sound it seemed magic. The other 2 made the mistake of turning their backs on Jon, and he moved and then they were down too, though not so final. Ramsay saw, and for the first time his mouth made a shape that could be called fear. He did not run. Jon had expected him to run. He threw something small instead, and it struck Ghost's flank and skittered off, but Ghost yelped, more surprise than pain, and Ramsay moved in that half-breath. Jon caught him with his sword guard under the jaw. It was a clumsy blow. It lifted Ramsay's chin and spilled a line of blood. The rain made it look like a thread of wine in a wash bucket. Jon followed with a slash that cut the bastard's cheek and would have cut deeper if something had not glanced his wrist. A thrown blade from the last man twisting on the ground. It saved Ramsay's life and cost him his pride. He stumbled backward, eyes blinking rain, and then he was gone in a flurry of bodies and weather, melting into men and rain and the yard's stone bones. They did not catch him. They took a dozen of his men alive and twice that dead. They took 3 Ironborn who had thought to slip over the wall in the storm and found themselves trapped between Winterfell and men more ruthless than themselves. The rain washed blood and filth into the drains and then into the soil, and the soil took it as it takes everything. When the counting was done, Jon sat with his back against the inner wall and let the cold come into him and then go again. Ghost lay beside him with his head heavy on Jon's thigh. To his right, a boy whimpered and then fell silent. To his left, Ser Rodrik told men to wash and to bury and to sleep in turns and to remember their shields in the morning. In the morning, Catelyn came to Jon not in the hall but in the yard. She stood before him and looked at him, not through him, and said, "Thank you." He had not expected that to be the worst wound of the day. He bowed his head so she would not see what it did to him. Word of the fight ran on fast feet ahead of ravens. The small folk in the outlying villages came bringing what they could bring. Bread, smoked fish, gratitude, grief. A woman from the village beyond the old holdfast gave Jon a piece of woven cloth dyed a blue so dark it was near to black, and it had a strange embroidery at its edge of a fish with a woman's face. Jon asked her what it meant, and she said it was something her mother had learned from a woman from the neck, and that it was for luck, and that it looked a little like him if he looked a little like a fish. He took it and gave her grain and salt and a promise that if her roof needed shingles, the men from the keep would come after their own were done. That night, as if the rain had washed the sky clean, the stars came sharp. Arya dragged Bran out onto the covered walk to see them. Sansa leaned in the doorway, inquisitive and quiet, lady's head on her boot. Rickon ran in circles with Shaggy Dog under the arch until old Nan swatted him with a wooden spoon. Ghost stood with his nose lifted to the air and breathed it like a prayer. Ned arrived 10 days later with a smaller host than he had taken south and more caution than he had worn when he left. He came at dusk, when the light gathers itself like a cloak at the shoulders of the world. Gray wind ran before the host like a harbinger, and his howl lifted every head on the wall. The yard filled with men again, but this time with voices like homecoming. Jon met his father at the foot of the stairs to the hall. Ned dismounted like a man whose bones had learned new aches. He embraced Jon so fiercely for a moment it seemed he might break him in two, then set him back and studied him with a scrutiny that was almost painful. "You have done well," he said quietly. "Lewin's letters told me, and Ser Rodrik's, but I needed my own eyes to see it. You are thinner," he added, with that stark dryness that sometimes made laughter rise in Jon in ways he did not understand. "The keep eats as much as any army I see." "It eats us," Jon said, and surprised them both by returning the wry smile. Ned's eyes softened, and for an instant there was no lord between them at all, only a father and a son. They were at table for hours that night, not feasting but close enough. The men ate and told their bits of war. Robb had grown into himself like a hound into a hunt, quicker, deeper-chested, but it was the mind behind his eyes that Jon saw most clearly. He had made some mistake in the Riverlands that he spoke of silently and often by his careful avoidance of certain words. He had also saved a town from burning by sending long spears through a ford at dusk where the Lannister men had believed the water too deep. The Riverlords called him canny. The great Jon called him lucky. Robb called it done and passed the bread. Ned spoke of Stannis's letters and of what they all implied. "I will not kneel to a lie," he said, and a murmur like the shiver through tall grass went through the hall. "Nor will I force the North to spend its blood like spilled wine to crown a green boy on a golden chair." "What of the South?" Catelyn asked. "Riverrun burns." "We have thrown water where we could," Ned said. "We will throw more, but we must husband our strength. Stannis will move. He is a slow knife but sure. When he moves, I think we move. Until then, we hold." He looked at Jon then and later, after the hall had thinned and the first snores rose like the sea in a far cave. Ned called Jon to the small room off the great hall where he kept a chest that smelled of old leather and salt. He shut the door. He stood a long time with his hand on the lid. When he opened it, Jon saw a woman's cloak the color of fog folded atop other things, and a sword belt with no sword, and a small harp with a broken string. "There are things I meant to tell you," Ned said. "I meant to tell you when you were grown. I thought I would have time. Time is a thing men think they own until they find it has been spent while they were not looking. He took a breath. When I went south to fight in a younger war, I made promises to your mother. I kept some poorly. I kept one so well that it has cost us both years. I will not speak names tonight, not yet, but I will tell you this: what you are is not shame. You were not made in shame, nor held in it. I have hidden you to keep you from claws you cannot imagine yet. If my choices have hurt you, I own that hurt. If I vanish tomorrow, hear me now. You are my son, and you are of the north, and I ask you to keep Winterfell while I can't. When the time comes that you must choose whether to ride to the wall, I will tell you all and ask you if you still wish to go. Jon stood with the weight of the words like mail wet on his shoulders. He had expected some of this. He had not expected the relief that was a pain of its own. He wanted to ask all the questions he had ever swallowed since he learned to speak. Wanted to say all the bitter sentences he had hurled at trees and stones and the empty yard in his head, and he wanted to say thank you. Instead, he only nodded once, because his throat was too tight for speech. They were interrupted before either could find another word by a rap on the door that was urgent enough to be rude if it had not been necessary. Maester Luwin entered with his chain chiming and his eyes wide. "Another raven," he said, holding out a scroll. "From the wall." Jon took the scroll like a man takes a relic. He broke the seal with his nail. The words were written in a rough hand. They were from Benjen Stark II, a man named Corin who made his letters like cuts. There had been dead things that walked, a ranger found with black blood and blue eyes, and a hand that moved after it had been cut from the arm. There had been whispers from the haunted forest louder than whispers should be. The Lord Commander would ride at first thaw. Ned read the letter after Jon did. He did not speak at once. He was a man who did not feel the need to rush silence. "At first thaw," he repeated. "That may be weeks. It may be days. I had thought to hold the north until the south squirrels gave us purchase." He looked at Jon. "We may not have that luxury." Jon felt the pull in him like a tide with teeth. "Then you understand why I asked before," he said, voice low. "It is not only what I want. It is a thing I feel like a draft from under a door." "I understand," Ned said. "I also understand that the wall will still be a wall in a fortnight, and that Winterfell may not be Winterfell if I ride tomorrow. I will send men. I will send Manderly's ships to Eastwatch if he will spare them. I will send Karstark's hard hearts and Umber's hard heads, and I will write to the mountain clans and ask them to send their best bold fools. You will hold here." Jon closed his eyes a moment. When he opened them, he found he could see the small cracks in the plaster on the far wall very clearly. He breathed once, twice. "I will hold." Winterfell held. It held through a storm that buried the west wall in drifts half again, a man's height, and turned the outer yard into a white lake. It held through a fever that took 5 children and would have taken Rickon if old Nan had not thrown fear in its face and dosed him with a bitter brew that made him vomit until even the fever fled out of disgust. It held through 2 more attempts to set a fire in the glass gardens, which Jon thwarted with patience and a rope rigged to pull down barrels of sand. It held through a thaw that revealed bodies unburied because they had been covered by snow at the wrong hour. It held through old grudges made new by hunger and mended by the sharing of a salted fish. It held, and with every day Jon felt that the keep itself had accepted him a little more, like a living thing that accepted a grafted branch and made it fruit-bearing. The Ironborn rose with their king and burned wherever they could. Torrens Square sent a raven that was a smudge of ash itself, then sent another that simply said, "Help." Lady Tallheart's nephew took a skirmish line into the woods and did not return. Jon sent men again, and he sent a letter to Deepwood Motte to Asha Greyjoy when a messenger spoke of her there holding with tactics that did not waste men on glory. He wrote, "The North is not your spoil." He wrote, "If you have sense, you will not waste it here." He wrote, "There is a colder war rising with no songs, and you will die nameless if you do not see it." He sealed the letter with wax and the dire wolf and sent it with a boy who could move like a hare over snow. He received an answer a fortnight later that was a strip of leather with a crude drawing of a wolf pissing into the sea. He laughed a long time because it was a small, rude grace in a season of grimness, and then he burned it and went back to counting arrows. Theon returned in that same fortnight. He came with 6 longships worth of men, or so he said. He came with a confidence that was as shiny as a new helm. He came wearing kraken silver at his throat. He did not come to the main gate, but to the old postern south of the kitchens. He sent a man through with a lie about a gift of salt fish, and then he came himself with men behind him to capture the gate. He did not capture it. Jon had set 2 men behind barrels there since the first attack, and those men blew a powder that made a bright white flash and a screech like a skinned cat when iron struck flint. The Ironborn and their new lord reeled. Ghost leapt for Theon's throat, then stopped an inch shy because Jon shouted his name in a tone he had never used before and would not use again. It hurt the wolf to stop. It hurt Jon more. Jon stood 3 steps out of reach and looked at Theon across the rain-wet stones of the passage. Theon's face was something that a lesser man would have called beautiful. Jon had never called any man beautiful, but he saw the shape of it now, and he saw how it had been used to charm courtesans and sneer at blacksmiths and make boys watch as if the sun had come up. He saw the fear in that face too, a child's fear that he had found a toy that now would not stop, a spinning thing that would not cease its spinning. "You do not want to do this," Jon said. "I do," Theon said. "I have to. You do not know what my father—" "I know what fathers ask," Jon said, and thought of the chest with the fog-colored cloak and of a woman's name that he did not yet know. "But I know what men choose too. My father is at Moat Castellan counting spears and deaths both and thinking of an old promise. I sit here counting onions. Either of us could have chosen something else." "You were set to this," Theon said, words rising. "Set, hewn like a piece of wood to fit. You're a bastard with a lord's work. You think that was choice?" "It was," Jon said. "It is, every morning." He stood and did not lift his sword. The men behind him shifted, uneasy. The men behind Theon muttered and looked at the walls and the old stones and at Ghost, who watched with whiskers wet and eyes red. "Leave," Jon said. "You can still leave. I will tell my father you came and left, and I will tell him you did it on my word. There will still be a bridge left to cross back. If you stay, I will burn that bridge as clean as summer lightning. I do not say it because I hate you. I say it because I owe my father more than I owe your pride." Theon's mouth worked soundlessly once. He looked at the men behind him. He looked at the men behind Jon. He looked at Ghost. He looked at the rain on the stones and the old iron hinges on the postern gate that had hung there when he was a child and had swung under his hand as effortlessly as he had thought the world might swing. In the end, he lifted his chin. "I am a prince of pike," he said. It made a sad sound in the passage, like a bone flute. "I do not slink away." "Then you die," Jon said, and he did not say it like a threat. He said it like a line from a book the maester might make a boy copy until the letters cut grooves through paper. They did not kill Theon there. He retreated with 2 men and came back with 10, then 20, then more, and then the yard filled with iron and rain and the scream of metal again, and men who had played knucklebones 2 nights before cut each other's hands to ribbons. Theon tried twice to reach the inner gate, and Jon denied him twice. The 3rd time, Theon's helm was knocked off and his beautiful face was blood and rage, and he came at Jon with something in his eyes that had nothing to do with kinship or walls or history, only with the need to break anything that told him no. Jon parried and stepped and cut. He did not cut deep. He cut enough. Theon went to one knee and looked up through rain and blood and had time to say, "Tell my father." And then men were between them, and he was carried away by his own guard like a man being taken by a wave. They made a mess of it, but they got out. They did not die to a man because Asha Greyjoy was not far behind Theon, and she had sense to spare. She came with enough men to haul him away without losing all of herself, and she saw the old postern for what it was and did not press where stubbornness would be suicide. She looked at Jon once over a line of shields, and for a heartbeat Jon thought she would laugh. She did not. She set her men to a steady retreat, shields linked tight, and went out under the rain with her face turned away from the keep, the better to see the field. Somewhere in that tangle was Theon, half-carried and wholly furious. They left a dozen dead and 24 wounded. Winterfell lost fewer by count and more by measure. In the wake there was healing. There was blood to scrub from old stone, and Jon scrubbed until his hands were raw because he did not think it right to ask others to wash what he would not wash himself. There were men to bury and markers to set, and Jon sent men with songs in their throats to sing for those who had had no songs sung in their lives. There was the quieting of children. There was the parley with the Dreadfort's men who had been taken alive. Men who called Ramsay bastard as if it were both title and curse. They were sent home under guard, thin and angry. Jon sent a letter with them saying that the next such attempt would be taken as a breaking of the peace of the North, and that the next prisoners would be hanged when taken, not sent home to be scolded. He sealed it with wax and the dire wolf and the kind of anger that is mostly fear held still, and he sent it. There were letters, too, to his father and to Lord Manderley and to the Umbers and Karstarks. He wrote apologies for losses. He wrote requests for barley and salted fish. He wrote that Winterfell would repay. He wrote that men had died for Winterfell stones and for the people within them, and that this meant something even in seasons when meaning seemed to be a luxury. He wrote a letter to Theon that he did not send. He burned it in the brazier and watched the words curl. In the God's Wood, the face in the bark watched him as it watched all things. Jon knelt there one afternoon after the postern fight, exhausted to the marrow, and laid his palm on the weirwood and spoke the few words he had left. "I do not know if you hear," he said, "but I do this in your sight. If that matters, let it matter." It was then that he felt it, hard and clear, like the snap of a string and the tone it gives. The air changed around him, lifted like a curtain in a breeze under the snow canopy. He smelled something under the deep resin and the hot water steam, something colder, older. It made his skin pebble. He lifted his head and saw that Bran was there, in his chair with Summer's head in his lap. Bran's eyes were far away and then near. "I dreamed of you there," Bran said. "Only you were a tree." Jon laughed. "I feel like one. You were a tree with a sword," Bran said, perfectly earnest. "You picked up men like birds in your branches." There was a bird with 3 eyes and he talked in my ear, only his words were inside my head. He said, "This one will have 2 lives." "I don't know what that means." Jon sat back hard. Ghost's ears twitched, and the wolf stared at Bran the way he stared at the woods when he scented deer. "Sometimes dreams are only dreams," Jon said. "Sometimes they are other things." Bran nodded as if Jon had told him something he already knew but wanted to hear in another voice. "There are men beyond the wall who dream like this. Old Nan says so. There are men who can see through a bird's eyes. Could you if you tried?" "No," Jon said, but he did not say it entirely sure. He said instead, "I can keep watch with men's eyes. That will be enough." On the day the first spring flowers poked green through the last slush, a Manderley ship came into White Harbor with 24 men bound for Eastwatch and a letter confirming that 3 more would sail when the winds turned. Lord Manderley added a list of preposterous foods he would send if he received in return 12 barrels of good northern ale, and beneath the list he added a note about a whale taken with fat enough to grease an entire city's boots. Jon smiled and sent a barrel and told Sansa to write a thank you on the keep's behalf that was polite, witty, and asked for what they needed without seeming to ask for anything at all. She did it so well Jon found himself a little in awe of the way words could drive a blade without making a wound. Ned rode out at last with Robb, north along the King's Road to take men to Castle and Holdfast, and then to turn east toward White Harbor to see Manderley's ships with his own eyes. He left Jon again with the keep and with a long look in which sat the weight of a name unsaid and the heaviness of a trust that was perhaps too large for the shoulders that carried it. In the second week after, the Reeds came. They came out of the mists like things born of mist, silent on their gray-brown horses, with cloaks the color of peat and slow eyes. Howland Reed did not ride with them. He had sent his children. Mira was all watchfulness and smiles that knew their own warmth. Jojen was the quiet of the gods with given legs. They came to see Bran, and they came because their father had sent a message to Lord Stark that had not said much and had said everything when delivered by those 2 young mouths. They stayed in the keep, and the air changed again around a set of eyes that could see over water. Mira went out with Arya and with Jon and with a set of men who did not know what to do with a girl who could throw a net on dry land and catch a boy by the ankles and laugh as if it were a game. Jojen sat long hours with Bran and spoke in a low voice about the way dreams can be a road, and what to do when a man meets himself walking on it. Jon watched, puzzled and wary, and moved in a way he had learned to hide with more care than his sword. "You will go north," Jojen said to Jon once as they stood on the wall and watched a sky so bright and pale it hurt. He did not say it as a question. "Perhaps," Jon said. "You will," Jojen said again. He turned his head, listening to something Jon could not hear. "You must not go yet. If you go too soon, the door you seek won't be there." "What door?" Jon asked, half exasperated, half amused, and then something in Jojen's eyes made him stop laughing. "What door?" "The one that is yours," Jojen said, as if it were simple. He went away then, back to Bran, two shadows moving together toward the godswood and the red mouth of the tree. The summer that wasn't came like a false promise, and the war in the south found its roar. Stannis moved, as Ned had said he would. Renly died, as songs said men like Renly ought never to die, surprising and cruel and quick. The Lannisters held King's Landing with tricks and wildfire. The Riverlands bled and bled again. Through it all, the North held to its own shape. Ned Stark had bent south enough to send men for justice and had kept the neck of the North thick and uncut. He sent bread where he could, and men where bread would only burn. He met messages from Dragonstone with messages of his own, measuring oaths with old law and new need. He said yes and not yet and no in a rhythm that was more craft than most men would know. One night, when the moon was narrow and cold, Jon went alone to the crypts. He had not gone in months, not since he had been too busy for grief and then afraid of it. He took a candle with him and went down the long steps with ghosts paused silent behind him. The air smelled of damp and of long stone. The faces of the kings of winter watched from their alcoves, stone wolves at their feet. He passed Brandon the Burner, who had set ships alight rather than let them take him to the sea. He passed Theon Stark of old, who had fought the Marsh King. He stopped before Lyanna's statue and set the candle in a puddle of old wax at her foot. "I don't know your face," he said to the stone. "I don't know your voice." He looked up at her garlanded with stone flowers, and the ache that always rose at the sight came up like a tide. "I think Father meant to tell me something of you." He laughed low. "I think in some ways I am still a child for hoping that words can change more than men do." He reached out and touched the stone fingers. They were smooth and cold, worn by hands that had come to touch before him. "If you were my mother," he said, surprising himself with the words and yet not entirely. "If you were," he stopped. Ghost stood so close he felt the wolf's breath on his hand. The candle flared and then guttered and then flared again. "Keep them," Jon said to the stone. "We will keep the rest." When he came up into the yard again, the sky had a thin light at its edge. He stood watching it for a long time. The pull in him had grown stronger, as if some great hand beneath the world had hold of a thread that ran right through him. He could name the pull now because of the letter from the wall and the story told in Lewin's tired voice about a dead man who would not behave as a dead man should. He could name it because of Jojen's eyes. He could not go. He had been told not to go. He would not go. He would hold. He did hold. He held men in line when their hands shook. He held women in words when their children ran fevers that made no sense and then broke like a wave. He held Lewin's hand when the maester woke in the night and said a name Jon had never heard, a boyhood friend perhaps, and then smiled and slept again. He held Arya by the elbow when she would have run straight out into the yard with her wooden sword while a messenger from the Dreadfort was being brought in because he wanted no accidents. He held Sansa's gaze when he asked her to go to the kitchens and make certain bread was broken in a way that made no man feel slighted, and she held his back with a nod like a pledge. He held Bran's chair as they wheeled it to the godswood and then stood back while Mira told a story about a serpent and a frog, and Bran laughed and forgot his chair a while. He held, and he felt himself be held, sometimes, by the old stones of Winterfell and by a patience he had not known he could own. In his dreams that spring he saw the wall. He saw it up close, and it was not a wall. It was a cliff made of glass and the bones of winters. He saw men walk along it like ants along a table's edge, and he saw beyond it the world like a frozen sea. He woke from those dreams more tired than when he had gone to sleep. He told no one. When he went to the God's Wood, Ghost sometimes set his nose to the north and breathed as if scent alone could lift a body and carry it across leagues. Jon laid a hand on the wolf's shoulder, firm. Not yet. Ned returned from White Harbor with the smell of salt on his cloak and a beard grown in odd patches. He had looked at Manderly's ships, and he had spoken with Manderly's priests, and he had eaten Manderly's pies, and he had smiled at the stories of Manderly's daughters, and he had promised Manderly's gold could be lent to the right cause. He sat with Jon late at night and told him stories from when he and Robert had been boys with steel like prayer and not like politics. Jon told him of the postern gate and of Theon and of Ramsay, and he saw something in his father's face that was as dangerous as any blade. Deep regret turned sharp. "I should have cut that weed when it was small," Ned said. "Now we will have to take the root with a spade and lose a lot of soil with it." They did not do it yet. There were other weeds that demanded tending. The Lannisters stirred. Stannis moved again, to the Blackwater and to a fire that ate men and made a new story in its smoke. The Freys did not ride when they said they would ride. The great Jon broke a table over some poor lord's knee, and then made the lord laugh and drink and forget his knee had ever existed. Catelyn prayed. Luwin wrote and wrote and wrote until his hand had to be bound in a heated cloth at night. It was Jojen who told Jon it was time at last. He said it when the first geese flew north low and early. He said simply, "If you do not go now, you will be late." "Late for what?" Jon asked, knowing better than to ask and yet compelled. "For the question," Jojen said. He went to Ned with the words still ringed in his ears. He found him in the small room off the hall, hand again on the chest. Ned looked up at Jon and seemed to know. "You needn't ask," he said with a ghost of a smile. "I will give you leave before you beg it from me." He was silent then, long enough that Jon heard the faint sound of the springs far below humming to themselves. "Come then, we will speak." He opened the chest and lifted out the fog-colored cloak. He held it not like a relic, but like a shirt that had warmed someone once long ago and kept her. He held it with his breath held too. He set it on the table and lifted out a small bundle wrapped in silk. It bore a sigil embroidered so faded it might have been any wooden thing, a box upon a field. He unwrapped it. There was a ring within, cheap-looking by lordly standards, iron with a bit of blue glass. He set that aside. He lifted out a square of parchment layered many times over. When he unfolded it, the air changed in the room, became thicker for what it contained. "Your mother was a Stark," he said. He said it not because it was everything. He said it because it was the first thing. "She was my sister. Her name was Lyanna." Jon knew and did not know. He had put the thought in a drawer in his mind and closed it gently a dozen times, 100, because he had had no proof to line beside it, only that ache in the crypts and his father's eyes when he looked at him as if he were remembering something he could not bear rehearsing. "She died in a bed of blood," Ned said. His voice was raw as a man who had breathed smoke all night. "She asked me for a promise, and I gave it to her. The world would have killed you to crown a broken boy in your place, or to shame a girl for loving wrongly, or to settle an old argument between kings. I took you home. I made my wife suffer for it. I made you suffer for it. Borrowed shame and bought silence. You are my son, Jon." He stopped, and the old words that had kept his tongue shut for years hung in the air like stalactites. He let them fall. "You are also of another house. There is a name you could wear if you wished it. I will not say it. If you want it, you may have it by law and by blood and by my word. If you do not, you need not. Neither name will change who you are. A name is a cloak. Men will see what they are made to see." Jon had found himself breathless listening. He had thought he would rage or cry or laugh. He did none. He felt as if he had been taking careful small steps along a narrow wall for years, and now someone had laid planks beside his feet and said, "Walk as you will." He reached out and touched the fog-colored cloak. He felt the weave under his fingers. Fine. He thought of the wall. He thought of the God's Wood. He thought of Winterfell and of the men he had judged over kettles and the women who had counted onions with him. He thought of the letter stating that men walked who should not. He thought of a three-eyed bird. "This does not change what I must do," he said at last. "No," Ned agreed. "It may change how you are treated when you have done it, or it may not. Some men cannot see the difference between two sorts of sky." "Did you love her?" Jon asked. It came out of him before he knew the why for it. "I loved her the way a boy loves a sister," Ned said. "It is not the love that makes songs, and yet it makes more than songs do. I loved her enough to break my word to kings and keep my word to her. I loved your mother enough to wear another woman's anger every day. I do not ask forgiveness for that. I ask that you take from it what you need." "I need to go," Jon said. "If I do not, I will lose the door." Ned smiled a little, as if even he had not expected to understand that, and then he nodded. "Go then. Take men. Take Ghost. Take our name, whichever you choose to use, and leave the rest with me. The North will hold." Jon wanted to say everything. Instead, he put a hand on his father's shoulder, a gesture that had been a son's and now felt like a man's. Ned put his hand over Jon's and held it a long while. When he let go, the warmth of it remained. Jon left Winterfell under a sky the blue of quenched steel. He left with a dozen men, good men, quiet men, and with Mira and Jojen at Bran's insistence, to take them to the man they had come for. He left with Ghost stretching out like a pale rumor ahead of them. He left with Sansa's bread, with Arya's crude drawing of a stick figure killing a kraken folded in his pouch, with Bran's handprint in ash on his right sleeve because Bran had made a joke about marking him as property so he could be fetched back if he strayed. He left with Catelyn's eyes on his back, not warm, not cold, simply watching, and that was its own forgiveness. He left with Ned standing on the wall, hand lifted once, then lowered. They rode north through the bar Rolands where the dead slept standing, and Jon felt the old power there and did not fear it. He had married fear back in the yard when the rain fell and Ramsay had smiled a dog's grin. He had kissed fear on the mouth and made it a part of him that did not churn him hollow anymore. They crossed the White Knife on a raft built with care and curses both. They slept in the commons room of a holdfast where a girl with a scar taught Arya's knife tricks to a boy who had lost 3 fingers and had expected to lose them all. They ate hard cheese and onions against the cold. They heard wolves at night and did not start, because wolves had become a comfort. At Queen's Crown, where a tumble of old stones stood like a half-dead tooth in the mouth of the marsh, they were met by a man with a beard gone white whose eyes were as sharp as any hawk's. He bore the black on his cloak. He had 3 men with him, and their horses bore the wall's smell, cold and clean and salt of their own. He put a hand to his heart when he saw Jon. "Lord Stark," he said. "Jon," Jon said. "Only Jon." "Corin," the man returned. "We go north. There's a song that needs singing, and it will have to be sung with steel." They went. The world changed around them as they rode. It became simpler and more complicated at once. The trees thinned and then thickened in a different way, stiff and dark with needles. The land rose and fell like a man's breath. The sky spread wide and pale by day and black by night in a way Jon had not seen since he was a small child and had thought himself the only living thing under it. They saw tracks that no man's memory living or dead could place, and they saw the marks of hundreds of feet moving south where no patrol had driven them. They found a fire cold and dead as iron that had burned blue. They found a man tied to a tree with intestines wound around his throat like pearls. They cut him down and burned him. Jon reached the wall like a man reaches a door that has always been in the same place in a house even when the house has changed. He looked up at it and felt like a boy, felt like a man, felt like something else as well. Ghost lifted his head and howled once, a sound that made the hair on Jon's neck rise and pleased some hollow place in him he had not known was empty. He thought of Winterfell then, of the yard and the postern gate and Arya's mud, of Sansa's careful letters and Bran's handprint ash. He thought of Ned's hand on his shoulder and of the fog-colored cloak. He thought of Theon's face in rain and blood and of Ramsay's pale eyes. He thought of men who had gone south to sing their deaths and north to freeze them. He thought of Lyanna's stone hands and the candle that had guttered and flared. He thought, and he did not look back. At Castle Black, the men of the Night's Watch greeted him with the gravity that is left to men who have few other things. Jeor Mormont had grown thinner since the stories had last painted him in Jon's mind. His voice was still a bear's. "We'll have you in black yet if we can trick you into it," he said. And Jon smiled and said he wore Winterfell already, and that was black enough. They spoke of business and of the dead. They spoke of the walk no one had yet made because men had been lost on the last one, and Jeor was not a man to throw sticks onto a fire just to make the flames pretty. "You must wait," Jeor said. "We will scout. You will learn our roads. Then, perhaps, you can be foolish in a useful way." Jon waited. He learned the stairs of the wall and the way wind found every seam in a man's clothing. He learned the names of men who would die and the shapes of men who would live, and how one could not always tell which was which by the length of a man's laugh or how he took his drink. He slept in a cell that smelled of old men and new fears. He wrote letters to Winterfell and made them ordinary so as not to frighten. He wrote to Ned, and once he wrote Lord Father, and then he crossed out Lord, and the ink bled a little, and he left it because there was too much in the leaving for a man to fix with a bit of sand and a knife. He dreamed once of a boy on a high ledge watching two golden people in a window, and he woke with a start and his hands clenched and the taste of guilt like salt on his tongue. He went to the top of the wall and stood with Ghost in the blue dark before dawn until his breath and the wolf's breath made one cloud. On the day the ranging left, the world was so bright with cold Jon thought it might break into pieces. He stood in the yard while the men mounted and adjusted straps and laughed too loud. Corran was like stone and like old bone. He looked at Jon and said, "You must do what you must do. If you cannot, do not go. If you can, you must." Jon nodded. He did not ask what the words meant because he felt that if he asked, the answer might slip between the words and vanish. He mounted. He rode. He crossed under the wall's shadow like a man stepping through a veil. South, Winterfell drew breath and breathed out. The keep did not miss Jon the way a man misses a limb. It missed him like a man misses a piece of a song. He only knew he loved when it goes quiet and the verse does not rhyme. Catelyn found herself looking to the high seat and thinking of the set of his jaw. Sansa discovered that the kitchen's girls would now require 3 words to achieve what once took one, and that those words should be chosen carefully and laced with humor. Arya went out to the Godswood and set a small figure in the roots of the weirwood. A stick man with a sword, made in jest and in honor both. Bran dreamed deeper. He spoke sometimes in his sleep with a voice that made summer lift his he. At quick as a deer hears a twig crack. Ned Stark stood on the wall and listened to the wind. He listened for a raven. He listened for footsteps from the south that might change the world. He listened for footsteps from the north that had already changed it. He carried a secret like a brand and did not let it fall. He told Catelyn more than he had told her in years, which was to say, enough that her eyes filled and dried and filled again. He wrote to Howland Reed and got a reedboat worth of words in return. Words that said what had been done could not be undone, and that what had been hidden should not be kept hidden so long that it rotted and made men sick. Theon Greyjoy stood on a cliff somewhere where water struck stone and sprayed up like hands in prayer. He looked across a field of waves toward a world that would never be his. He laughed so hard he bent double. He straightened and grinned and called to a man with hair in his eyes and said, "Bring me my bow." And the man did. The truth was not as true to Theon as the way the bowstring felt under his fingers. He drew. He loosed. The arrow arced and fell and kissed the sea and vanished. He smiled as if it had been a crown. Ramsay Snow looked into a polished bit of metal and practiced a smile that might make a child come closer and was really meant to make a lord lean away. He had a thing in his mind like a map, and it had Winterfell at its center, and he traced lines to and from it that were not roads but cuts. Asha Greyjoy counted men and counted horses and counted knives and found she had fewer of each than a sensible woman would like. And then she went and took something anyway, but not a keep, not yet. She sent no more letters made of leather to Winterfell, and perhaps that was a kindness. Mira Reed told Bran stories about slow things that win in the end. Jojen watched the sky and chewed a blade of grass as if time could be taken into the belly and kept there warm. At the wall, Men could hear the ice crack deep within, like a groan. Jon rode with Corin, rode with others, rode with Ghost padding beside him without sinking because wolves are made of something that learns snow. He saw the places where the wildlings had gone south and were now between the wall and the world, and he saw the places where something else had moved. He saw a woman on a ridge with hair like fire and a laugh like a challenge, and he raised his sword and lowered it and felt that sometimes the right decision feels wrong in the moment and correct only later when a man looks back and sees the path his feet have trod. The question came for him in a pass where the world narrowed to a knife's edge and wind cut a man's skin without drawing blood because it had already drawn it and taken it and left only a numbness. Corin took Jon aside and said words that hurt. "You will need to be thought false to be true. Can you do that? Can you wear another face until the time comes?" Jon thought of the fog-colored cloak. He thought of the names he had and did not have. He thought of Winterfell and of how he had worn Lord's work without a Lord's title. He thought of how some men will never see what you are. "I can," he said, and in saying it felt something within him go quiet, as if a harp string had finally been tuned. He did it. He broke a promise to keep one. He did not break the vow he had not yet taken, because he had pledged to Winterfell's walls and to his father's eyes, and what he did now was in service to those as much as to the wall. He took on lies and wore them until they felt like rough cloth on his back. He carried them as he had carried grain sacks in Winterfell, grunting, breath burning, aware that sometimes a man's best is only not dropping the burden until his work is done. When he returned to the wall, it was with blood on his hands and a bone-deep knowledge that he had crossed a threshold from which he could not step back easily. Jeor Mormont looked at him and saw not only the deeds but the making of deeds, and he nodded once like a man who receives a letter he had expected and did not entirely wish to read. "We'll have you in black yet," he said again, and Jon did not smile. A raven came to Winterfell in those days with a message that was only 3 words long. Said, "The dead walk." Ned Stark read it in the hall, and his face did not change. He set it down. He took it up and read it again, as if the words might have shaped themselves better the second time. He called for Catelyn and for Luwin, and for the great Jon who had returned with stories that grew larger each time told and with 1 finger fewer for his trouble, and they stood around a bit of parchment that made men feel very small. Catelyn said prayers to gods not her own in the godswood and did not apologize. "Men will say that the north grows hard ghosts of men for winter and keeps them near the fire so that the wind cannot have them. They will say that the wall is a folly and a marvel both, and that men who walk it learn to think like birds. They will say that in a time of kings and crowns and shining lies, one lord in the cold dared to say no, and that his no changed the way a realm breaks. They will tell this story badly and well. They will leave out the part where a boy holds a ledger and writes a woman's name carefully because she has never had her name written in fine ink before and he thinks that matters. They will leave out the part where a man chooses to send a barrel of ale to another man because he knows the men who drink it will laugh and work a little better and not kick the dog. They will leave out a girl's laughter under the arch after dark and the way a wolf leans against a leg when a man needs leaning. But Winterfell will keep those parts, as it keeps everything that happens within its stones. In the last days of that false spring, Jon stood again on the wall and watched the north with eyes that had learned to weigh what they saw. Ghost stood beside him, calm as a god before an altar. The sky to the north had a color in it he had not seen before, a pale green like sea glass, as if some great hand had scraped a mark along it. He felt the pull again and knew the name of it now. It was not the wall. It was not only Winterfell. It was the thread that tied him through both to something older, something with the taste of iron and the sound of slow water under stone. He thought of his father and of the words given to him like a blade he could take or leave. He thought of Lyanna and of a cloak of fog. He thought of Theon and of a door built of choices. He thought of Ramsay and of a knife that had missed his heart by a thumb's breadth and of the line of a scar on a face that would haunt him in the dark sometimes and make him smile bitterly in the light. He thought of Arya's stickman and Sansa's bread and Bran's hand in ash and Rickon's wild grief that had burned out like a fire in straw and left a steady small heat behind. He thought of the weirwood's face and of how the red tears are not only sadness but sap doing what sap does. He put his hand on Ghost's head. The wolf breathed and the breath turned to fog and then to nothing. "We'll hold," he said into the wind. The wind, as it ever does, carried the words away. They went down the long face of the world and across the forests and over the barrows and along the roads where men were dying for different answers to the same questions. They went to Winterfell and brushed over Ned Stark's hair where he stood on the wall, and they went into the Godswood and stirred the leaves and made the steam lift in a shape like fingers. They went through the cracks in the wall and into the haunted forest, and in a place where the light did not come even at noon, something that was not a man turned its head as if it, too, had heard a promise and wanted to see whether it would be kept. Jon kept it as long as he could. Winterfell kept longer. The North keeps longest of all. That is what the old men say, sitting under their cloaks in halls where steam rises like ghosts and bread smells like home. That is what the wind will say if you listen to it in the right grove, with your hand on a certain tree, with a wolf at your side and a name in your mouth that you have chosen to keep.